This is a tutorial to show how I use my Surface Pro in conjunction with a numeric key input pad. Obviously the Surface Pro hasn't got any express keys as you might get in a Wacom product. I have therefore developed a method to map keys on this Bluetooth numeric keypad into ArtRage functions. So this Bluetooth keypad actually works as express keys would on a Wacom product. I use a free tool called AutoHotkey, which provides the mapping of each individual button here into relevant different functions in ArtRage. So first of all, I need to turn this on. There's a button at the back which I can slide to on, and then I just select the button there, the light comes on and then off, and I know it's ready to go. I'll now step through all the different mappings that I've got assigned to my numeric keypad. The first one I'll do is probably the one I use most, which I have mapped onto the Shift key. In ArtRage, when you press Shift and move the pen, it increases and decreases the size of the brush. So that, as you can see, is easily accessible. It's the easiest button I can select, and it's the button that I rest my thumb on when I'm using this. The one next to it, the number 8, is the Alt key, which is a colour picker. If I call up the colour picker, change the colour to different ones. I can then use Alt to colour pick, which is probably the next most frequent one I use, which is why I've got it alongside number 7, so those two are easily accessible. I'll now go through the keys along the top line. The tab is an undo, which again I use quite frequently, so that's easily accessible. And the asterisk is redo. Now, there's a good reason why I haven't put them alongside each other. This key here is for control, which usually in ArtRage is drawing straight lines. And that's something that every now and again I use, and I've kept it within common reach for a very good reason, because it's above the Alt key, and if you press Control and Alt at the same time and then put the pen down, you get the colour picker coming up, which I've got to be honest, I don't really use that often, but it's there to potentially use in a quick way. I tend to use the colour picker down here to select my colours, but for convenience I've got the functionality of the Alt key and the functionality of the Control key. The Control key is also useful for when I use stencils. For example, if I call up a stencil, and then I can use the Control key to easily resize it, which is quite useful. So it has that functionality as well. Key over here, which is a little bit more difficult to reach, is for saving. Obviously a very useful shortcut. Not something I need to do too often with ArtRage 5 because it is very stable, and I have also noticed that on a couple of times when it has fallen over or crashed, it saves my document before it falls over properly, and therefore I can restore it. And the next two mappings I've got below it are also, they're actually fairly reachable, but obviously not quite as reachable as these ones here. I have got a flip command with a single key for a quick look to see whether your painting looks okay for a fresh perspective. I'll point out that the flip doesn't flip all the layers, and it doesn't flip the top level view, it just flips the view. I've used AutoHotkey here to only attach the flip view to a single key press, so that when I do select it I can get off and use any of the other keys accordingly. By default, ArtRage uses the H key or the V key to perform a quick flip, but you need to hold the key down, which will stop me using any of these other keys. So I've used Auto Hotkey to define the button state of down or the button state of up, which will perform the flip. I'll show you how I achieve that later on when I go through the Auto Hotkey script. The key below this here sets a transform for the layer. It is now in transform. You select the layer, which is just selecting the current canvas, and it will transform the layer that you're on. Do whatever you want to do with it. These keys here, 4 here in like a reverse L shape, for all the common tools that I use. 9 is assigned to oil brush. 6 is assigned to palette knife. 3 to airbrush. And 2 to delete. Those are probably the most common tools that I use. So if I'm painting away, I don't really need to do too much in the way of selecting options and selecting tools within the menu system or the tool picker. The key 4 here is used to move the canvas around when the pen touches the canvas. And because I've got this attached to the space key, it means that because the space key is just below the shift key, if I then press the 2 at the same time and then pen down on canvas, it gives me a zoom in and zoom out. Now there are many different alternatives to moving the canvas around. One of them is to use shift and then right click, which is the button here on the side of the Surface Pro pen. If I do shift and then click, I can zoom in and zoom out, or if I don't do shift and I just click, I can move the canvas around. I used to use that quite a lot until I realised after several hours of using it in a painting, my hand would become quite fatigued because this isn't an easy button to keep pressing all the time. Unlike the Wacom pens, which are very responsive and doesn't take any effort to press, this is actually, over a period of time when I'm doing it all the time, because I tend to move the canvas quite often and zoom in and zoom out, it just becomes a bit fatiguing because I'm squeezing my hand all the time. But with this, I don't need to do that. I'm not using this button at all. Relating to this, I've mapped the enter key to the right click. It probably won't matter too much because I don't right click too often, but just to save me again a bit of fatigue in the hand, I've mapped enter to be a right click. Now for the keys along the bottom. These ones are fairly difficult to reach, so they're not often used commands. The first one here is transforming all layers. For example, if I create another layer on top, just create something on it, I can then transform all layers, and I might want to flip, which means that I'm flipping everything. This is something that I would do fairly often throughout a painting. A quick flip is fine to see how things are going, but every now and again I would want to flip everything, which includes all the layers and then the top level view. So I will then work on that for a period of time and just have a refreshed view. So I've got a shortcut with that, and then a couple of presses would flip it. For example, I did use the pop-up there. I could also just select transform all layers and then use my flip to flip it. And then I just press tick and then that would flip it all back again. Now, I've gone through all the different functions here, which is quite a lot of them mapped onto each individual button. But because you have a numeric keypad, it also enables you to assign more functions. We just use this button here to pair up the Bluetooth device, but once it is paired up, if you now select it, it will activate the NumLock facility, which enables more functions to assign to different keys. The keys along the top here and the keys down here will not change. They're always going to be the same. But these keys here are defined slightly differently now because these keys are actually assigned to be the numbers rather than the functions. For example, before I was mapping to home, up, page up, etc., etc. But now the NumLock key is activated, I'm now mapping in auto hotkey to the numbers themselves. So this opens up another set of functions that I can perform. Now, because you need to select the numlock, I've assigned the less commonly used or my less commonly used functions to this set here. So for example, I have these 3 keys along here which are related to layer functions. If I select the layer here on top, sometimes I may want to make the layer visible or invisible. I can toggle on and off. I can select any layer I want to and then toggle on and off accordingly. So I don't need to go into this menu here to do that. The next one alongside it is to clear the layer, which is something I often use as well. I may toggle on and off and decide, oh no, I don't really like the look of that. The next one I've got here is the page up. I have assigned this to merge layer down, which is also something common that I use. For example, if I just undo that to bring the mark back, I can say, toggle it on and off. Actually, I'm happy with that change that I've made. Let's merge it down. Let's just page up. Ironically, page up is layer down, but I know where that key is. The next set here is relating to setting blend modes up. Again, if I just undo that so I can have a layer set, if I select number 4, it auto selects blend mode of normal. Now I have achieved this by using facilities within auto hotkey, which enables you to manipulate the position of the mouse. For example, when I select number 4, I have worked out where the position of the menu is regarding tools and then layer options. I've worked out where that position is. I've worked out where the menu for the blend mode is, and I've programmed in the X and Y coordinates to go up and use mouse clicks for those X and Y coordinates to select the menu. I have programmed number 4 to select the normal, which would default a blend mode, for example. I have then mapped on number 5 to start cycling through the blend modes, which is something I actually use quite often to experiment with different types of overlay to see what works and what doesn't work. To demonstrate this, I will add in a new layer and then I will select a fill tool and I will fill it with a selection of colours. This would more clearly demonstrate what's going on. So if I try spectrum, select that and then fill that. Now I'll just cycle through and I'll have an idea of the way it looks. It's just, as you can see, it's just selecting the menu each time, but it is incrementing onto the next blend mode just to see what the differences are. As you can see, there's different types of display here, and I might just settle on one that I like potentially overall. And as you can see, it's gradually selecting the next item off the blend mode list, and then the next item, and then the next item, and the next one. It's coming towards the bottom now. So you're getting to the most interesting ones, and that's the very bottom one. And then it will cycle all the way back up to normal again. The next row down is relating to layer opacity. The N key is mapped onto a function that retrieves the current value of the opacity on that layer. For example, if I move that down to halfway-ish, there we go, down to about halfway, I would first want to increment and decrement based upon the current opacity value I've got. Therefore, the first key mapped here is retrieving the value, the current value of the opacity. So if I select that, that's retrieve that value. Then if I press these 2 keys, they increment and decrement the current value of the opacity. Number 2 is to decrement. As you can see, the opacity is changing. And number 3 is to increment. I've currently defined the increment size as 5%. 5% seem to be about right. So I would toggle up and toggle down to see what roughly works and settle on a certain value. And it's almost instant feedback because it's applying the value each single time. Now just going back, because there was one function that I missed here, just going back to the setting of the blend modes, on my original set of functions here, there is the end key, which I have mapped. The end key enables you to set whatever blend mode you want to. The end key will open up the blend mode menu and enable you to select whatever blend mode you want. Therefore, if I select end key, there we go. I've got all the blend modes. It shows which blend mode is currently selected as well, and I can select whichever one I want to. I'll also point out that it's not just the numeric keypad that I have mapped different functions to, but it is also the volume up and volume down buttons that I have mapped functions onto. For example, if I was drawing and I didn't have the keypad available, for example, but I still wanted some kind of express key functionality from a basic level, rather than, for example, if I was changing the size of the brush, I would need to go to setting up here to change it. That would only go up to 100% though when you drag it up and drag it down. If you wanted something larger, you can input the value yourself. But again, I would really want to use the shift key for that. So that's one important mapping that I would want to have. Therefore, I have mapped the volume lower to act as a shift key. So if it was only the Surface Pro that I had without any numeric keypad, I could use that. For example, I would just hold it like that and then just rest my hand there, and then I would just use that accordingly to do whatever I need to do. And of course, as shown before, I use the color picker quite a lot. If I wanted to color pick, I would have to select the color pick tool each time and then select a color and then go back to my all brush tool or whatever it is. So I have mapped onto the volume up the color pick. So I have those two tools mapped, which in theory can give me a good drawing experience if it's just a Surface Pro that I had. Again, I'll show you how to do that within the auto hotkey script. That's where it's controlled for it. Overall, I actually find it very comfortable to use this keypad. I've tried using express keys on Wacom products before along the side, but even using those, I find they become quite fatiguing because they're in the same place all the time. I mean, obviously I'll just emphasize this as my own preference. I find them quite fatiguing. They're always in the same place, and if I'm drawing at an angle, my hand is slightly awkward positioned all the time. But with this, I can easily hold it in one hand and I can move it anywhere I want to. I can hold it whenever I want to. I can move it around. I don't need to keep it at an angle or anything. It just sits naturally in my hand. I don't need to hold it up. I may just lie my hand on the ground or something like that. And I'm only using the thumb, and my thumb hasn't become fatigued at all using that. I fully support it with all my fingers underneath, and the thumb just moves across as so. The next step then is to demonstrate how I have arranged my auto hotkey script. Okay, now what you're looking at is my auto hotkey script. It's in the location of the startup folder under Windows, which you can access through a shortcut key there, which is shell startup. Take you right to it. I can tell that it's mapped into auto hotkey because it's got the H character alongside it. Therefore, because it's in the startup program, whenever Windows starts up, it will be present and it will be running, so that whenever you run ArtRage, all the keys will be mapped as I have just demonstrated on the numeric keypad. You can see that it's running by having a look at the H key there. We know that that's running. To download auto hotkey, just go to autohotkey.com, select download, and download auto hotkey installer. Let's open this one up. I'll go into edit, script. I've also got a tool called SCITE for auto hotkey, which enables more control over the scripting of auto hotkey. If you just do what I did and you haven't got this tool installed, then it just bring it up in NumPad. But as you can see, it's color coordinated, enables you to run and debug the script as well.
You may want to download that if you want to use this. I'll just go down through auto hotkey and describe what each bit does and relate it to the demonstration I've just done. So here is the auto hotkey script. These lines here with a semicolon in are just comments. We'll ignore the first part of the script. These are functions which are called by elements later down in the script. Let's scroll down through that. This first line here means that all the commands below it are only mapped when you're using ArtRage. It says ArtRage 3, don't worry about that, that's what it's currently set to at the moment. That will work for ArtRage 5 as well. This means, in theory, that if you wrap up a whole load of different commands and map them to different functions on the numeric keypad, you can map the keypad to any different shortcuts within any different application. For the moment, I've just done it for ArtRage, and that's all I really ever use. As you saw in my demonstration, I demonstrated volume up and volume down being mapped to the Shift and Alt. As you can see, that first line is just a straightforward comment, and then the two lines below it is typical of what auto hotkey defines. You have your key that you want to map at the start, so that will relate to a key on the numeric keypad, and then alongside it, separated by two lots of colons, you have what you want to map it to. For example, if these lines weren't present, the volume up would still do the volume up functionality, but this means that when you now select the volume up, when you're in ArtRage, it will activate the shift. That's a very simple example where it's just a transposing of one key to another. There are more complicated examples below. This one is slightly different in the fact that this mapping here is typical of a lot of the mappings, where it's not just a single key that is mapped to the tab key. As you saw in my demonstration, the tab is mapped onto the undo, which of course is typically Control Z for most applications, as it is in ArtRage. We've got the Z key there, that's fair enough, but also there is a modifier key here which you can define. The little hat character is defining in auto hotkey terms the control. Therefore, in two characters, you have got the definition of Control Z. Therefore, selecting tab on the numeric key maps onto Control Z, which is an undo in ArtRage. Similar with all these keys as well, in that there are some which have little hat characters and some which don't. The divide key, which is mapped onto the control which provides the line, is just defined as a straightforward control. As you can see, it's just a straightforward mapping. Again, I put in a comment to describe what it would do within ArtRage to make things a little bit clearer. Home is straightforward shift, up, alt is just a straightforward color pick, page up, oil tool, which is defined as an O. NumPad sub, this is where things get a little bit interesting. As I explained in my demonstration, the pressing of the H key does a quick flip of the canvas, but you need to keep the H key pressed down to be able to maintain the flip, which doesn't give you a chance to select any other key. So what I've done here is I have defined some auto hotkey commands to be able to tweak things a little bit, to make things a little bit easier. There are many different auto hotkey commands, but I'll just describe the ones that I have used. Get key state just gets the state, well, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It gets the state of the H key. If the state is D, which means that the key is down, so therefore it's defined as being held down, then I send the H key to be up, which will simulate the H key being released. Otherwise, it will simulate the key being down, and that means that it will simulate the key being permanently down, as if you have kept your finger on the button. But because this is only a single key mapping, when you press the subtract key on the NumPad, it will do all these checks. And for example, if you have the key up, which would be its initial state, then that statement set to D would fail, and it would go into the else part, and it would set the state of the H key down and then return out of it. Therefore, a single selection of the subkey would set the H key to down, and then if you select it again, because the state is now set to D because it was set to down, it then puts it back to up again. So it would then flip and then unflip. Again, just scrolling down through the other commands here, just the left key, which is a move canvas. Again, the comments are very helpful. Straightforward mapping of a single key. Plus T is different, as you can see. It's relating to the NumPad add is relating to some kind of mapping of T, but it's mapped onto a plus rather than a little hat character. And the plus relates to the modifier shift. Therefore, the NumPad add is mapped onto shift T, which is mapped into transform into the ArtRage app. As you can see, these are all fairly simple mappings at the moment, but there is a potential for you to map any string of characters that you want to. For example, if there's something a bit more complicated that may be mapped onto either ArtRage or any other program, you could easily map a single key to a string of commands. For example, one I have experimented with is to permanently flip the whole canvas, including all the layers, and that will be stringing together a sequence of commands which will be transform all layers, flip, and then enter. So that's a way that kind of stringing multiple commands together can be used. The N key here, which I demonstrated towards the end, calls this command here. So this is something different to what we've seen before. This is a function call. The script portions that we've skipped over at the start contain a function called open blend menu. Therefore, if I skip towards the top of this script, there is a function here called open blend menu. So this will be called when you select that key. The res correct is something I put in that I'm still not entirely sure about. When I've set the display percentage to different values, the X and Y coordinates to the blend menu hasn't quite worked, and I've never quite figured it out. It seems to be double the resolution or half the resolution a lot of the time. So I have kept this value here that I can easily tweak if things don't quite go right. For example, it is defined at the top of my script, and then here I put in a useful comment, not sure about this yet, correct for different resolutions. At the moment it's set to 1, so it has no impact whatsoever, but sometimes I've seemed to need to set it to 2 to be able to get it to work, but I haven't quite worked that out yet. It seems to have been working for a long period of time now, but I have had issues sometimes. It might be related to restarting my PC whenever I've set a certain resolution. I haven't quite figured out the sequence of steps, but I know that just changing that to 2 would solve a lot of my problems. So I've just left that one in there. It's almost something that I'm keeping in the back of my mind for the moment. But as you can see, the res correction is actually used as a divisor. Therefore, if it's set to 1, it's going to have no impact on the calculated value here. In order to select the blend menu, you need to select the tools, layers, and then the blend mode menu. Using a useful tool, which is this active window info, I can tell, as you can see, it's got a lot of information about the window that the cursor is moving about in. And one of them is the X and Y position. For example, I ran up ArtRage and then I worked out the X and Y value of the tool menu, the layers menu, and the blend mode menu, and then just stuck the values in there. They don't need to be too precise. I just roughly moved it into the exact middle of each individual menu and then just plugged those values in. That's the only way to do it using this method, because rather than just mapping keys which are relating to certain functionality within ArtRage, there is no key which does what I want it to do. There is no single mapping that sets the blend mode, and there's no single mapping that sets an increment of blend mode. Therefore, I am reproducing a piece of functionality
relating to artificially accessing the menus of ArtRage. So that's why I need to plug in these values here. But now those values are defined, they should work, certainly for the Surface Pro they should work, but if this method is used on a PC with a different resolution, for example, the menu info window will need to be used to work out the X and Y position of the menus of the blend and then just plugged in. These commands here are calculating the offset values of the menus relating to blend mode. Once those are calculated, I then perform auto hotkey commands which simulate clicks, and they simulate left clicks as defined by the left text there, and whether it's going to be up or down or not. For example, without realizing it, when you're clicking on a button, you're performing two actions. You're performing a down action and then an up action. For auto hotkey, you need to define within the click routine whether it's down or up. So what this line here is doing is that it's clicking to an X and Y position, which is being calculated as a pixel coordinate above, and that's selecting the left mouse click, which obviously would be a typical mouse click you would do in Windows, and it turns that down, and then it's using exactly the same coordinate because this is just a mouse click down and up in the same place to activate the menu. It then uses an up, which just releases the key, so therefore that would select the tools menu part. The next two lines would then select the layers. As you can see, I've named the variables something moderately reasonable to make things more readable. And then the last one selects the blend menu. So when all these three sets of up and down clicks are collated together, it means that what you're left with is the menu, the blend menu. And of course, you can apply the same principle to any menu that you want to select. If there is no shortcut keys defined for a specific function, then you can map the X and Y coordinate to whatever you want to do. Let's have a look at the next one. The next one is erase, so that's a straightforward single mapping. Page down, single mapping again from the tools. Again, the next lines here, the hat characters are simple Control T and Control W for warp. The warp I needed to map in ArtRage itself under the keyboard shortcut setup. By default, there is nothing set up for warp. There are a couple of keys in here which I did need to set up. The enter key is not a straightforward key press mapping because I wanted it to be a right click on the display. Similar to the commands above that we just went through, it's using the click command, and this time it doesn't need to pass in the coordinates, it's just a click at the current position of the mouse pointer. It's just going to do a right click, so that's all that that's doing. That covers all the standard commands, the non-numlock commands to do. As you can see, the main aspect was just learning the names of all the buttons when the numlock isn't selected. Now that the numlock is selected, you can see that it makes sense because the numeric keypad is now locked on, and therefore the keys that were formerly named whatever they were named are now named with a number on the end, which does make a whole load of sense. But that shows you the ability to define additional keys when the numlock is set, because the definition of the keys changes, and therefore within the script it's treating it as a separate key almost. So you've got twice the amount of keys almost. So 7, 8 and 9 is straightforward. They're all mapped to a control and then a key. NumPad 4, reset the color blend cycle to normal. So this is relating to when you want to cycle through a whole load of blend modes. I thought it was probably a good idea either to clear the blend modes to set it to normal, or possibly to start a cycle of blend modes from the top. As you can see here, I have set a variable up called current blend mode set to 1. So that will be a variable which is defined right at the top.
And after that, I then call a function called setBlendMode, passing in 1. If we scroll up to setBlendMode, you notice that it's quite complicated in the way it's set up, and I'll explain the reasons for that. As you can see here, it's the name of the function that we're calling, and it's accepting the value of 1 and assigning it to the variable blend number. Current blend mode I have now set to 1, and res correct, as I explained before, is always set to 1 for the moment. Here I'm just assigning different variables. For example, number of blend modes is quite important, as I'll explain later on. I have defined here the X and Y of the normal blend mode as described before by calling up ArtRage and then opening up the active window information. You can ignore the mouse get position. It was something I was experimenting with, which just shows the power of auto hotkey more than anything, that it can retrieve the current position of the mouse, which may be useful for something. So the X pos and the Y pos will contain the value, the X and Y coordinates of the mouse position. There's something I've commented out here. This is usual part of my debugging process, is that when I'm not sure of a certain value that's being set within this script, I use message box, which displays on the screen the value, which in this case is current blend mode. The section increment defined here is the difference in pixels between each subsequent blend mode on the menu itself. Because I'll be cycling through the blend modes, that means that I need to select each blend mode in the menu in succession. Therefore, I need to calculate the next position of the blend mode menu. So that's what this is relating to. I have judged that it's 10 pixels different initially between each blend mode menu. Section gaps is an interesting one in that the blend modes is divided into different groups regarding what it does. For example, there's a selection which typically darkens the image. There's one that lightens it. There's maybe a miscellaneous one. For example, difference and exclusion is in a separate group. Therefore, because there's a line separator between each group, there is a little tweak that needs to be done to ensure that given the current blend number, that the proper menu is selected. I can't just rely on the 10 pixel each time, because the further I go down through the menu, the more likely the offset is going to be incorrect, because there are typically a lot of separators, which is what I do here a little bit lower down, but we'll get to that one in a minute. Block input on, that means that it's stopping any additional input when it's performing this calculation, which means that it's less likely for any mouse press or any other interaction to interfere with what I'm doing. Open blend menu, as we've shown before. As I explained before, blend mode number is passed in as an argument to this function. We have only passed in blend mode number 1 because it's just setting it to the normal one. But these statements here are for when the blend mode starts to increment, when we start to cycle through each different blend mode and performs the necessary calculations regarding the group separators. Therefore, the larger the blend mode gets, the greater the value the section increment becomes. And that's what this piece of logic is doing here. Here we're providing the calculations, we're summing everything up. Initially, the Y offset was set to the position of normal as defined above. We then just add in the number of the blend mode, times it by the Y increment, which will move it roughly in place. And of course, that's not taking into account the blend mode group separators, and then adding in the section gaps on the end. After we've calculated the correct Y coordinate, we then just want to perform a simple mouse click. Therefore, there is a down action and there is an up action applied, which will select the relevant blend mode. Final bits of this function. Now we've performed all those things, we want to now not block off any input. As part of calling this function, I have decided to increment, therefore add by 1 the current blend mode.
I am assuming that whatever calls this is pretty much wanting to cycle through the blend modes. And here is just a straightforward check which enables us to wrap around the blend modes. Therefore, if we reach number 27, which is the very bottom one, it will reset the blend mode all the way back to number 1 again, which is the normal. So you can wrap around forever if you really want to do that. That was setting the blend mode to 1, which is a normal. Now that we have got that function set up, it means that life is easy for us when we come to cycling through blend modes. All we need to do now to cycle through them is pass in the blend mode as the argument. As we saw in the function just defined, when the set blend mode function is called, the current blend mode variable is incremented accordingly as the default behavior. That would therefore ensure that the blend mode is incremented by 1 each time, and hence select the subsequent blend mode, giving you a blend mode cycling. NumPad 6 is not defined as anything, but I've left in there as the unique identifier for it in case I want to add in anything in there in the future. Just comment it out for now. Now we come to the opacity settings. NumPad 1, as you'll remember, gets the current opacity value. Again, it's calling a function, this time not passing any value into it, but this time it's returning a value and storing it into this variable here, current opacity. So let's see what get opacity value does. The way I managed to extract the opacity is by opening up the opacity window, which enables you to enter the opacity via the keyboard, and then copying that value to the clipboard, and I can access it from within AutoHotkey. For example, send. So this is slightly different than what you've seen before regarding usage of the hacked character. And before we've just had it a straightforward mapping from one to the other. But this is another way that AutoHotkey can also simulate key presses, and it can use the send command. The send command here is, as it says, it simulates a Control-E character press. Return here, this returns the value returned by the getTool window value. And therefore it's another function, so if we look just above it, there is a getTool window. There's lots of comments in here, so it pretty much explains what it does. This has taken a bit of fiddling around to get things to work. The first command is a sleep 100, which sleeps for 100 milliseconds, which is a tenth of a second. That means it will just pause for a tenth of a second. When this function is called, the opacity window in theory will be displayed, but I need an extra delay to ensure that that value has actually been displayed. If I didn't have this value in here, when I was trying to copy the value displayed onto the clipboard, it wouldn't work because I think it hadn't quite filled the text entry field. Now a big long comment here. Now copy the contents to the clipboard so we can access the value. And as I said, it's always useful to put in comments. Haven't figured out yet how to get the value from the tool window. This was a workaround that I managed to figure out. If you're writing scripts within ArtRage, for example, in a .r script file, then you have access to all the ArtRage native functions that can return these values for you. But because I'm using AutoHotkey, I have only got the ability to retrieve what I can via mouse and keyboard interaction. Therefore, by a single ArtRage function tool, I cannot get the opacity, but there is another way to do it. And that's the way I've done it here, is that I'm using the clipboard to retrieve the opacity value so that I can then increment and decrement it from its current value. Therefore, clipboard equals nothing means that I'm just clearing the clipboard of anything that was there before. And then I am sending Control-C, which is a standard copy command. When the opacity window comes up, fortunately, the value is auto-selected, therefore it's ripe to be able to copy that value because you've got the selection there. That's what I'm doing here. So this sending Control-C of the standard copy command copies that opacity value within the window. I then call this routine here, which is waiting for the clipboard to contain some valid text.
For example, if I didn't have that there, then when I returned whatever's on the clipboard, which is what that line there is doing, then it may not be present. Because typically, doing anything like this, there are slight delays involved when data is being written from one place to another. So this clip wait ensures that there is data on the clipboard. I then send an enter key because now I have copied the value to the clipboard. I just want to pop the dialog down. And then I now know that the clipboard will contain the value of the opacity, which I'll then return. That return value then gets returned to the get opacity value, which is then returned to here. Therefore, the current opacity is set to whatever opacity value is on the layer, and then returns. Now we have the current opacity value. It's a straightforward question of, on the decrement and increment, is just to decrement and increment it, and then that's pretty much it. This if statement here is just a straightforward check. It's a boundary check. For example, if the opacity, which could happen within this code, get negative, then I just set it to 0, and a similar thing happens when I increment the opacity. If it's greater than 100, I just set it to 100, and then that's it. After I've changed the opacity, I then just call the routine which sets the opacity value. So again, if we scroll up, we can see what that function does. Again, we just call up the opacity window, sending Control E. And here was the only way I could get this to work. In theory, I was playing around with auto hotkey and different sends and send inputs, and just sending the number itself, but that never really seemed to work. The only way I could do it was by sending each key at a time, and that's what this loop here does. It takes the value that you passed in. For example, if it's more than one character, if it's 82 for example, this loop here steps through each character of the 82 value, and therefore for 82 this send input would be called twice, with a loop field on the first time round being set to 8, and then on the second time round being set to 2. That seemed to work, so I thought that's fine, it's not really an issue. I wrapped it up in a function here. In theory, I could pass any value I want into the top, and it would just pass through. If it was only a single digit, then this loop here would only pass through a single time and send a single character. That seems to work, so that's fine. And after all that, I need to send the enter, so that it accepts the opacity value. Therefore, what I've done is I'm just incrementing, decrementing the opacity value, and then I'm just setting it accordingly, and that's pretty much it. Coming down here, again, these last two are very straightforward, except this one here is slightly different in the fact that, as I explained before, you can almost string together any number of different commands you want to. Before, we know that the hat character means control. We've also got this exclamation mark as well. This exclamation mark is an alt command, and that is the settings for the select layer contents that I've mapped. And that is the setting within ArtRage to set it up. And the dot is a straightforward Control D for all of that. This last line here is wrapping up what we have defined up here, meaning that all the statements between those two lines are everything that will be actioned using ArtRage. So that's pretty much it. There is a link to this script left in the description if anybody is interested, but that's just an explanation of how I've mapped all my keys and how it enables me to focus more on my painting rather than interacting with tools, especially on a Surface Pro when the display is set to very low. It can be quite difficult sometimes to select certain menus. This enables me to not even really think what I'm doing. After a while, I've developed a muscle memory with all these keys. A lot of the time when I'm using the Shift and the Alt key, I'm not even thinking about what I'm doing. I'm just focusing on what I'm painting. And that's what this is all designed to do. This is designed to
function as the express keys on a Cintiq, for example, and to improve the experience, certainly within a drawing app on the Surface Pro. Of course, this could be applied to any other program as well. This can be applied to Photoshop or anything like that. So that's it. In theory, I haven't tested other numeric keypads, but I would think there's a good chance it'll work with most of them because the buttons are defined should be pretty universal, I would think. I'll also leave a link in the description of the numeric keypad that I use. Okay, that's it. I hope this might help.